Yeah, we'll have to find out what that means. Let me take my hat off.
Thought we were going to learn how to study the Bible.
Well, we got that coming in a couple weeks. I just needed a few weeks to just kind of do something a little less intensive and to kind of catch up. So, we'll open with prayer and then we'll get into the topic tonight. So, Father, we come before you, we give you thanks. We thank you for great weather. We thank you for the ability to come together here and to learn more about you and to be able to be encouraged and lifted up as we go through the week. Pray that you give us all safety as we go home tonight. Provide safety for those in our community that aren't here. And let these words and this learning be an encouragement to others. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks. Amen. So I'm going to pull up my notes here. So what I mean by monuments against Israel, of course, coming off of a really great trip to Israel here recently, when I've gone the past couple times, they've really been what I guess, and Tommy will say as well, archaeological trips. Visit a lot of sites that most people don't visit. I was really, I think the best compliment I got from our Israeli guide was that in 32 years we had put together the best itinerary he'd ever seen, and that he wished everybody that came would use his itinerary. And I promised him, I said, I really want you to be critical and tell me what to improve and not just be, patting me on the back or something. And he said, no, I'm telling you, it's the best one. So, but a lot of that is archaeology, and I really run the risk of people getting bored. You know, when you think about it, not everybody's into archaeology, but this trip anyway, it didn't seem nobody got bored. And that's really good. But as we were going through one of the sites, one of my favorite sites, Tel Dan in the north, it is probably one of the two oldest sites that you can see. The walls there date back to about the 10th century BC, so time of David. But there's one section which is a gateway to the city that predates even all of that, which goes back to the time of Abraham. And they affectionately call it Abraham's Gate. We don't know that he actually went through it, but it's really interesting. It's really neat. I love that whole section because you have that goes back that far, but then the walls of Dan, the city that was established at the time of Israel, those walls still stand. You can see the city gate. You can see when we think about, if you read your scripture sometimes, it talks about men at the gate, men at the entrance. This was a place of judgment, a place of ruling, and you can actually see that seat right there at the gate. So it's a really interesting sight. But as we were standing there, I was able to speak just a few minutes on archaeology because there's a find there, and we'll talk about it here in a minute. A very important find or discovery that happened there at Tel Dan back in the 1990s. And so I expressed to the group, one of the things when we look at the history of Israel, because there's a lot of people who are not favorable towards Israel. They would say Israel didn't really exist in the past. Israel wasn't really a nation. The Bible's not true. Some of the best evidences we have come from the enemies of Israel. And so that's where this title, Monuments Against Israel, comes. So tonight, I just wanted to kind of nerd out a little bit, geek out a little bit, talk about 4 monuments, and really 5. I forgot to put one on here. If you come to my office in my house and you sit at my desk, on the wall above my computer and stuff, I have 4 pictures, and I should have 5. But the 4 pictures are 4 of the 5 monuments that we'll talk about tonight. I need to add the 5th one, but they are these monuments up there because they're all monuments from the enemies of Israel, but they talk about Israel. And so we don't really Israel doesn't operate the same way, or at least we haven't found that they do. The ancient world, kings, whenever they would have victories or whenever they would have great events that made them great as kings, they loved to talk about themselves. And so what would they do? They would erect a monument, and they would talk about themselves and whatever great feat that they have achieved. Or, in the case of some Assyrian kings, they would erect entire buildings with wall reliefs dedicated to their achievements. And so tonight we're going to talk about a few of those that the enemies of Israel have done. And the first one that we'll see, our little clicker hadn't been working, but I worked on it today and it's working now. So this first one we're going to talk about, this is the one that was discovered at Dan, Tel Dan, the place in northern Israel. It's called the Tel Dan Stella, or the Steely. That's Stele. So if you see that word, it really refers to a monument, somewhat what we would think of like a tombstone. And actually in the ancient world you have funerary or burial stele as well. It's basically a monument that's usually taller than it is wide, and it has some inscriptions on it that are dedicated to a king. In 1993, Hebrew Union College, so this is a really important college. It's still very important today. It has 3 campuses in the United States and 1 in Jerusalem. The main campus here in the United States is in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a Reformed Jewish university, the largest Reformed university in the world. It is solely responsible for all of, like, when they train rabbis for the Reformed Judaism movement or cantors, they all train there. But they are also very, very prominent and one of the best universities in the world when it comes to languages and archaeology. Not every university is big into archaeology. Even if they discuss it and study it, they're not out doing digs. So the Hebrew Union was responsible for a lot of the dig sites in Israel, at least through the 90s and early 2000s. And they're real big in languages. When you think about Moabite and Akkadian and Sumerian and Ugaritic, all these really kind of unknown languages of the ancient world around Israel, most of the people in the world trained usually come from this university. So very extensive university. My professor, you've heard me talk about him before, Dr. Cloud, he got his PhD from Hebrew Union and was actually on the dig site in 1993 when this was found. He didn't find it, and he wasn't there when it was found as far as that day, but in the year for that. Go ahead.
How big is that piece?
This piece right here, so it's probably about this big. This is just a fragment, and there's 3 fragments found. So the dig was in 1993 led by a guy named Avraham Biram, very famous scholar in Israel. And in 1993, a person named Gila Cook found the first fragment, which was the smaller fragment on the bottom left. And in 1994, found the other 2 B1 and B2 fragments. They published their finds in 1993 and 1995, and the dating for this goes back to the 9th century BCE, so this will be very familiar as we go through a few of these. This is about 100 years or so after the time of David, and that's very important to remember as we talk about this. In a minute we'll talk about the importance of it, what it means for David and Israel, but it's about 100 years after David. David's like 950, he comes and becomes a king, something like that, 10th century. It's written in Aramaic, so I think everybody here understands what Aramaic is. Very similar language, Semitic language, similar to Hebrew. And what's unique about this being in Aramaic, before this, they had thought Aramaic was like maybe 4th century BC. And so when we have texts of the Bible like Daniel that have very extensive writings in Aramaic, they would say, well, these couldn't be ancient. Genesis has Aramaic. These writings can't possibly be really old because they contain Aramaic, and Aramaic's not that old of a language. Well, this was really a prominent discovery that showed that at least as far back as the 9th century, and then later on we found 10th century, 11th century BC Aramaic inscriptions to show that Aramaic was definitely in use back then. What this stele shows is it details the death of Jehoram or Joram of Israel, of the house of David. So there's a line you can't see or tell from here. If you go from the bottom right-hand corner of the stele and you were to go up 5 lines to the 5th line up, it it names Joram of Israel of the house of David. Beit David. Everybody kind of knows a little bit of Hebrew here. You know enough to know that Beit David is the house of Israel. And this story corroborates some of the Bible. 2 Kings chapters 8 through 9 talks about Joram, who is the son of Ahab and Jezebel. He becomes a king in Judah. The scriptures call him evil in the sight of the Lord. But it says that God allowed him to maintain his power for the sake of Judah, for the sake of Israel, basically for the sake of his covenant. But he was one of the kings of Israel that's referred to as evil in the sight of the Lord. 2 Chronicles 22, 7 through 9, and specifically 2 Kings 9, detail his death, which would be a little slightly different than what this Steely is probably trying to present. The Steely is probably trying to take credit for the death of Jehu, but the scriptures say, the death of Joram, but the scriptures say that Jehu was responsible for the death of Joram. And so we kind of have this question of how can it be? How can Jehu be responsible according to the scriptures, but then this king here? And to give you some more insight, Hazael, who's mentioned in scripture, Hazael most likely is responsible for erecting this Stella or Steely. Really, what probably happened is that Hazael, in cahoots with Jehu, was responsible for. Just like we know all the time that kings of the ancient world especially would influence other people in other nations to do things for their benefit as well. So that's probably what happened. We really think that Hazael is the person that created this Stella. He was an Aramean king, and it makes sense that he would be the one to erect this, as he would have spoken Aramaic and been very well versed. That would have been his native language. Hazael himself is mentioned in 2 Kings as conquering the entire land of Israel, with the exception of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is maintained all the way until the Babylonian captivity. There's many people who come and attack Israel from the 10th century all the way down through the 7th century, but it's not until Babylon that Jerusalem falls. But Hazael definitely gives Israel a run for their money. When it comes to the inscription, the House of David, it is very important because up until this point in 1993, 1994, there virtually was no evidence, or not virtually, there in reality was no physical evidence for the existence of David. We had no inscriptions, no signet rings, no stamps, no potsherds, nothing to say that David ever existed. And for a lot of liberal scholars, they would actually say that in the real extreme, that David never existed. But if they did say that David existed, they would say, well, he was really just equivalent to the mayor over a small village. He was not this great king. Israel wasn't this great nation. He definitely didn't have this great dynasty. And then we get to this discovery in 1993, 1994. Not only does it give proof of David, that David was a historical person who existed, it insinuates that David was definitely a king over a nation. And not only was he a king over a nation, but he was a king that warranted a dynasty, because this is 100 years after David. And the king is represented here as Joram of Israel, of the house of David. So, yeah, go ahead.
So is this the first proof of David?
First proof of David in 1993, 1994. Exactly, yeah. And so not only is it just that he's a king or he's more than a mayor, he warranted a dynasty that 100 years later the king was being referred to as of the house of David. And so this was really good proof. Now, of course, there have been people who have said this in no way they've kind of questioned the translation of the inscription. You'll kind of see this with all discoveries when it comes to Israel. There'll be clear proof that this is proof of the existence of biblical kings or the nation of Israel. And of course, there's critics who will say, well, that doesn't really say that. So they've come up with all kinds of stuff. The house of uncle, the beloved uncle, the house of kettle, the house of the beloved. But all in all, and obviously, I'm a believer of the Bible, and so I'm unbiased as well. But when you take this in conjunction with the timing, right, we date this back to the time of Joram himself. It's not like it's dated to a different period. the 7th century, 200 years after Joram, or 100 years before him. This is actually dated to the time that he would have been a king in Israel, and in conjunction with other archaeological evidence from places like Khirbet Qeiyafa, there's really no doubt. The majority of scholars would say that this definitely is an inscription of the House of David. So this is currently housed and has been housed since the 1990s in the Israeli Museum, or the Israel Museum there in Jerusalem. So you want to come to Israel with us, we'll let you see the Tel Dan Stella. It's really neat to see. It's really kind of, I'll tell you, you ask the size, and I used to think it would be something huge, but you go and you see it. And again, this is just a fragment, but you go and you see it, and it's just in this little case, like this big. So couldn't find the rest of it. And of course, this is done in a place where there was destruction that happened, and they're trying to destroy things. And so when we talk about some of these others, like the next one, those are kind of preserved because they're in a place where you didn't have destruction. You talk about the Assyrians, you didn't have the same kind of a destruction going on. So, but this one is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And so obviously my mentor is really home to him, and so I love to talk about the Tel Dan Stella. But this is the one where we were at Tel Dan, and I was able to say, a lot of people don't realize that some of the best evidences we have for Israel are the inscriptions of their enemies. So it didn't change. I just bragged about having it fixed, and now it's not going to work.
Is there a button back there I can push?
Well, yeah, you can go, if you want to go back there, I'll start talking about it. It's the green program called Proclaim. If you just open it and click the next slide, you'll see what I'm talking about. It should change it. I just bragged about having it fixed, and now it doesn't want to work. Yeah. We'll see. So the next one, you see the Proclaim?
Program slide on?
No, not slide only, the other at the bottom.
Oh, okay. I was just looking to the right.
Yeah, it should open like a slideshow type thing. And you'll just, no, not that one, the other one. There you go. Thank you. So this is what we call the Black Obelisk. Any ideas on why we call it the Black Obelisk? It's black, made out of black basalt. Any other reason? It's an obelisk. An obelisk is just a structure that usually has 4 sides, and it's kind of like a pole. The Black Obelisk was discovered in Nimrud, Iraq. So I don't want to go into the details of all of Iraq, but Iraq really has a lot of really neat archaeological discoveries. Iraq is the house of Babylon. Whenever you are it's the home of Babylon. That's where Nimrud here represents Kala. Kala was a capital of Assyria at one point, and it also has like Nineveh. Nineveh is found in Iraq as well. This is not very far from Nineveh, probably 30 miles, but it's south of Mosul. A lot of people have heard of Mosul, Iraq, through the invasion of Iraq and the Iraq War. We had a lot of presence in Mosul. Ashur-nasir-pal II, that was a king of Assyria, and he moves the capital from Ashur to Kala, the place where this is found. This was like a big deal back in the day. Ashur, A-S-U-H-R, or Assur, this is the capital of the city. This is where we get the name Assyria from. Ashur was the capital for a long time. He decides he's going to build this huge city. He said, the capital is great and all that, but I'm going to, again, talking about the kings of the ancient world outside of Israel, and inside of Israel too. Israel's going to get to a place where they want to expand their borders. They want to do everything they can to make a great kingdom. But for sure, outside of Israel, so Ashur-nasir-pal II, he says, I'm going to move the capital and build this great city. He spends tons of money, lots of labor, and he has a big grand opening. And he writes about it in his throne chambers, the wall inscriptions. He writes all about this great big city and the great big party he spent all this money on. He had a feast for thousands and thousands of people. He lists like all the bulls and the goats that he offered. It was a whole bunch of food. It's really crazy to think of how big this banquet was, if it was realistic. Most likely, it was a little exaggerated. But even if it's a little exaggerated, it would be like feeding, the entire Ouachita Parish in one banquet. Like, it was a big deal. He had built a zoo. I mean, we have this huge zoo that's built in the middle of the city at a time where zoos weren't really a thing. He had huge botanical gardens. He had large amounts of gold and treasures and just gold everywhere. And so this city was huge. When it opens up and people start to move in, it eventually will have 75,000 people in one city. And we have cities that have millions of people, but at the time, this was the largest city in the world. It was huge. And in 1846, Sir Austin Henry Laird, very, very famous archaeologist, British archaeologist, he finds this amongst many, many, many other things. I don't know if you remember, Tommy, we were in the Israel Museum, and at one point there's this huge relief. It looked like it was bronze or gold on the wall. It was just this big, huge thing over the whole wall. And I think it was depicting Tiglath-Pileser capturing Lachish. And that was a replica, but that was just a portion of the reliefs that came from the city capital here and the big throne rooms and all of the palace of Ashurnasirpal. But the British had commissioned Austin Henry Laird to go and do these archaeological digs. There's really neat history behind all of it. I won't get into it tonight, but Austin Henry Laird was a politician, a bureaucrat. He was just really well known, really wealthy, but his passion was definitely archaeology and biblical archaeology. He found, just tons and tons of stuff in Iraq, most of which are housed in the British Museum in London. Along with this one is housed in the British Museum. But right after Ashurnasirpal II, right after he builds all this great city, the king that comes after him is Shalmaneser III, and y'all may have heard that name before. He came right after him, and he erects this black obelisk to commemorate his deeds, just like anything else. And this is erected and put in the middle of the city, in the city square, in the middle of everything, right in the middle of a civil war in Assyria. And so there's political things that are going on. Shalmaneser III wants to say, look at the great deeds I've done. Look at how all of the kings honor me. Look at what all I've done for our nation. He's really making a plea for political gain in the area. So he erects this in 825. So it has four sides. If you notice, it's an obelisk, has four sides. Each side has 5 reliefs or 5 pictures. And so you'll see there's 20 pictures. And so what I used to think was that each column depicted a different thing. But as I looked at it a while back in my studies at school, I was in an archaeology class. We go over all this stuff. I realized that it's not columns for each king, but each king is on the same column. So on the one that's shown here, the side that's shown here, from top to bottom, it shows 5 kings giving tribute to Shalmaneser III. So the first one at the very top is a king called Suwa of Gilzanu. That's in northwest Iran. And the second one is Jehu of the house of Omri. So a lot of times Assyrians would always refer to Israel as of the house of Omri. This was referring to the northern tribes, but it's Jehu of the house of Omri. Right under him is an unnamed king from northern Iraq. The fourth one is Marduk Apel Usur of Suhi. This was from the middle Euphrates, kind of south of Iraq. And then the fifth one was Kalparunda of Patin, which was from Turkey. Most of those mean nothing to any of us. You'll never remember those names again. The second one's important, right? Jehu of the house of Omri. So they're 5 down, and then as you go around the obelisk, the pictures that go around are related to those kings down, if that makes sense. So the pictures go around, they relate to each king. And then there's cuneiform script, Akkadian script, on the top and bottom of it. And that's how we know what these things are. It's not just pictures and we try to figure out, oh, this picture could be this king depending on what they're wearing. There's actual writings. You can't really see it very well. There's writings on the top and the bottom that are actually describing the pictures. They're telling you who the kings are. And the inscription for Jehu says, I received a tribute from Jehu, the son of Omri, silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vessel with pointed bottom, a golden tumbler, golden buckets, 10, and a staff for a king and spears. So that's what he says that Jehu gave to him. This dates to about 841 BCE. So again, 9th century. So at the same time that we have the Teldan Stella with the king of the Arameans saying that he beat up on Israel. Now we've got Shalmaneser III saying he beat up on Israel, and that Jehu gave alliance to Assyria. Again, this is housed in the British Museum, but they've actually made copies of this. I haven't seen any copies or the original in person yet, but they have copies or replicas of this in Chicago, Harvard, Washington, D.C., Salem, Oregon, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Denmark, and the Netherlands. So one day I'll see, hopefully, the original in the British Museum. That's one of my future trips that I hope to take. If you could change it to the next slide, please. You got it? Okay. This is what we refer to as the Mesha Steely or the Mesha Stella. So this one you can kind of see. The Teldan was broken and fractured, right? So you can kind of see how this one, how I was saying, it kind of looks like a tombstone. It's a monument that's taller than it is wide. And so this was erected by King Mesha of Moab. It's often referred to as the Moabite stone because it's from Moab. But so those are the two names, the Mesha Steely or the Mesha Stella or the Moabite stone. Moab, if you're not familiar with the geography, is in modern-day Jordan, which is east of the Jordan River. And so this was dated to around 840 BCE. So here we go again, 9th century. Yet another nation that's going to declare that they whooped up on Israel. So 840, just a year difference between this and Jehu. The details of this describe an event where Chemosh, 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 the god of Moab, is angry with the Moabites. And he says here that he allows them to become subjects of Israel. But, of course, Chemosh is eventually going to go with Mesha, and it says it's going to throw off the yoke of the Israelites from around the Moabites. So that's the gist of the inscription. It also details, like every other stela that a king's trying to say all the great things he did, it also says all the different kind of building things. It says that Mesha built all these great building projects and stuff like that. But it's written in a type of Phoenician. It's really kind of similar to Paleo-Hebrew, if you're familiar with that. Not the pictographic Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Semitic Hebrew, but the Paleo that's kind of like chicken scratch almost. It's similar to that. It's not Paleo-Hebrew, but it's very, very similar. And all these languages are kind of intermingling each other. If we think about the size, and I always tell people this because we think of countries from America. If we're from the United States, we think of other countries in relation to our size as if, like, Britain's the size of the United States or something. Israel's the size of New Jersey. So you think of how close that is, and every nation around it's the same size, really. So you kind of see how these languages can just overlap and stuff like that. It was discovered by a guy named Frederick Klein. He was an Anglican missionary from Britain, and it was discovered in 1864. At the time, and really to this date, it's the earliest discovery within the region of Israel, because think about the Teldan Stella was discovered later, and then the other discoveries that were before this are discovered way over in Iraq. So in the region of Israel itself, this is the oldest discovery. There's a city today there called Dibon. It's D-H, or Gibon, D-H-I-B-A-N, Jordan, just for reference of the modern location of where this would be. When they first found it, the Anglican missionary made a relief of it. Now, usually we think of like putting paper down and, you can kind of color. Similar to that, but he actually does, and a lot of people today, youngsters, won't know what I mean when I say this, but I think everybody here will. They took and basically made a paper mache relief of it. They took paper and wet it and did all that stuff. And thankfully they did. It became very political. They didn't want to give it up. And the missionary didn't want to just take it. So he makes this relief to say, hey, this is where it's at, this is it. Eventually they're going to give the stela over to French scholars. And they become, there's a local Bedouin tribe, I can't remember the name of them. There's a local Bedouin tribe that becomes angry. They think that, well, we shouldn't be giving this up. This belongs to our region, we shouldn't be giving this to the French, and they actually smash it to pieces. And I don't know if you can, you can't really tell from that picture. But they smash it to pieces, and this French scholar eventually gets all the pieces back, and he takes it to France, and he uses the paper mache relief to help put this thing back together. And so when you see it today, it's actually pretty intact. You can see the cracks through it, but they actually put it together really good. And it's that impression that was made early on really made the task very easy. They probably could have done it without it, but it made it real easy. This provides major evidence for the Moabite language. So when we talk about languages of the ancient Near East, this specifically is just about our only inscription from Moabite that we have. There's a few Moabite scholars out there, and this is really what they go to when they study the Moabite. It's given a depiction of 2 Kings 3, verses 2 through 38. And you do have some differences here, but those differences can be expected, just like with Jehu or just like with what we find with other inscriptions. It depends on who's telling the history as to how the story's told, right? So we can expect some differences. What's unique to this is the earliest extra-biblical source for the name Yahweh. So where other inscriptions will talk about Israel, this inscription specifically has the name Yahweh on it. So that's very, very unique. We're talking about a 9th century inscription that has the name Yahweh. It's one of 4 inscriptions at this time that has Israel. So it has Israel on it, and it has Yahweh on it. The other 4 are the ones we're talking about from the same period. This one is housed in the Louvre in Paris. So you're familiar with that museum. When it comes to the inscription, I just have here, there's actually a lot of inscription on this whole stone that mentions Israel several places, but I have the main one that people mostly think of. It says, now, as for Omri, we think about what we said about Assyria. They always referred to Israel as Omri, or the house of Omri. But here it says, now as for Omri, king of Israel, he oppressed Moab for many days because Chemish was angry with his land, and his son succeeded him. And he also said, I will oppress Moab. It was during my days that he said this. So that's kind of like the beginning of the inscription. Then it talks about Moabites, and then down towards the middle of it, it talks about how they're going to throw off the yoke of the Israelites. So very, very special Stella and inscription for Israel's history. Next slide, please. This is referred to as the Menptus Stella, or the Steely. This is also referred to as the Israel Stella or the Victory Stella of Merneptah. So this is the Menptus Stella. It was discovered in 1896 by a guy named Flanders Petrie. It was discovered in Thebes, Egypt, which was the capital of Egypt. And it was translated by a guy named Wilhelm Spiegelberg. This is really the only inscription of Israel in Egypt, but it's really old. This was found in Merneptah's funerary chapel. So kind of like, how Egypt, when you think of Egypt, they have these rooms or big areas dedicated to their burial. This was discovered there. And Merneptah was Pharaoh of Egypt, and this is really important for us because people will say Israel, even if they were a nation, they were a very small nation, they were just a community around Jerusalem, and they didn't really exist till way later, like 8th or 7th century. This one here is from Merneptah, and he was Pharaoh of Egypt in 1213 to 1203 BCE, so 13th century BCE. Go ahead.
Spell that again. I looked up victory and it's showing a different one.
Oh, Merneptah, Merneptah, Merneptah,
M-E-R-M.
Merneptah. Merneptah. M-E-R.
Okay, got it.
Got it? There you go. So he was Pharaoh over Egypt from 1213 to 1203 BCE. And if you look at the dating of, if you've ever looked at the dating of the Exodus story, you have kind of two dates. You have what's an early date and a late date. You have a few people that would put it in the middle of those two dates, not very many scholars at all. But depending on where you side on the dating of the Exodus, it's either going to be 15th century BCE or 13th century BCE. And so what's important for this is that regardless of either of those dates, what you have here is Merneptah speaking of Israel as if it's an established nation, or at least an established people group inside the land of Canaan at this time. So not only have they escaped Egypt, but they've escaped Egypt and they've had enough time to establish themselves and to be recognized by the king of Egypt or the Pharaoh of Egypt as a nation called Israel. So really important to us. Most of the stela details his victories in Libya. So thinking of Libya, that's the other side of Egypt. He's mostly saying, look at all the things that we've done. But when it comes to the last 28 lines on this stela, he really talks about his victories in Canaan, in the land of Canaan. And he's going to talk about other things other than Israel, but he's also talking about Israel. And when you get to line 27, so next to the last line in the stela, you get to this place where it speaks of Israel. And when we think about the dating of this, you think about the other ones we've talked about, 9th century BCE, this one being 13th. It's easily the earliest textual reference to Israel, and it's the only one in Egypt. So, and you can't expect anything much more earlier than this. When we think about 13th century, this is at the end of the century here. So this is either, if you're a late date Exodus guy, this is right after the Exodus from Egypt. But if you're like me, you're an early date Exodus guy. This is a couple hundred years after, and Israel's had time to establish themselves as a nation. So very important with our understanding. It gives us something to think about when we think about the dating of the Exodus and different things like that. What's really neat is Petrie found these, and he calls Spiegelberg in to help translate them. Petrie had some translation issues. He wasn't as strong as Spiegelberg, but he knew a little bit. I mean, he's working and digging in Egypt. He knows something. It's not like he's just there digging up rocks and calling other people. But Spiegelberg's an expert. And so he calls him. He gets confused about line 27. He says, I need you to help me with this line 27. And they're working together, and it's related by them that at some point as they're trying to figure it out, Petrie yells out, Israel. And so then they look, and sure enough, and Spiegelberg agrees. He says, that definitely says Israel. And they sat down to have dinner that evening, and I don't even know how this story was told and written down and quoted, but Petrie was quoted that evening at dinner saying, this Steely will be better known in the world than anything I've ever found. And sure enough, it definitely is. This one is now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, Egypt. So very, very important stela. And when I was putting these together, I put 4 on here, and I kept thinking, man, I'm missing something. And sure enough, I was missing one called the Kirk monolith. So I don't have a picture for the Kirk monolith, nor do I have the extensive background to it. But it's actually one of the 4 that's on my wall at home. I included here, I'm trying to think of what's on my wall at home. I have the Teldan Stella, Teldan Stella, Black Obelisk, Mesha Steely. No, I don't have the Teldan Stella. my favorite of all is not on my wall at home. So I have everything but that, but then I didn't include the Kirk monolith. So the Kirk monolith is, it's actually plural. There were monoliths that were found in Assyria, and what's unique about them is that, and this is just me off the top of the dome, it refers to Ahab, king of Israel. And so, again, yet another king. It's not just saying Israel, it's saying Ahab, the king of Israel. And it's a monolith that dates the time of Ahab. What's the time of Ahab? 9th century. Again, we've got all of this going on in the 9th century. But it speaks of Ahab, the king of Israel. And what's unique about this one specifically, all but this one, when Assyria talks about Israel, they always refer to it as Omri. But here in this one inscription, it refers to Ahab, the king of Israel, not the king of Omri. So just a unique thing with it. And that's really all I could remember about the Kirk monolith was Ahab, and that it references Israel and not just Omri. So lots of kind of like nerdy information. That's really all I have tonight, but I hope, I really love archaeology. I love what it can help us understand about the Bible. I love that it helps us with our time frames. I mean, these things get dated to the exact time, give or take, 10 years, that the Bible itself is relaying the happenings that are going on within the Bible itself. So really important finds. It kind of goes hand in hand. The reason I did this right after the history of the Bible, and next week may be another week of archaeology as well. We'll look at some more archaeological finds, talk about some different things that help solidify some of the things we find in the Bible. But I felt it really came naturally after the history of the Bible. Understanding the history helps us understand our Bible better, and then seeing the things that we find in the dirt all around the place of Israel helps us solidify those things as well, just like the history of the Bible itself. So, any questions at all? Would open up to questions? Yeah?
When each of these were found, it was in an
Archaeological
archaeological dig.
dig, yep. What's really sad when we think about the Black Obelisk, I should have put a picture up. You can actually Google Earth, Babylon. People don't realize that like the ruins of Babylon were like still standing. We go to Israel and we look at all these ruins and it's all, Tommy said everything's knee high. You go to Iraq and you go to where Babylon was, it was like full buildings. You could see the full gates of the city, all this stuff. And in 2015, when, what was it, ISIS, when ISIS is kind of doing their rampage, ISIS viewed Babylon and all of the discoveries of Babylon as anti-Islamic. These are pagan, this was a pagan society and pagan things, and these aren't good. And so what's sad is that at least in Nimrud, where the Black Obelisk was found, they had beautiful city gates. I say beautiful, I mean they're from a pagan society, but just beautiful for us understanding the ancient world. And they took bulldozers and just bulldozed the entire archaeological site. So 2016, the Iraqi army took over the site in Nimrud, and ever since then they've been guarding all archaeological sites in Iraq with the military, but in Nimrud especially, they destroyed 90% of the archaeological site. Really was a travesty. But if you're interested, they've just opened up archaeological tours to Iraq for American citizens in the past year. So anyone want to go to Iraq and see Babylon. What's left of Babylon? If you go to Google, just go to Google Maps, type in Babylon, Iraq. It'll bring you to it. It'll have little places you can click, and it'll pop up pictures of what's there. It's really phenomenal. So.
Now, is that the same time they blew up the Arch of Baal?
All that stuff. They were blowing up everything and trying to destroy anything that was not Islamic. They just viewed all that stuff. And again, even for us, as you see, it's not that it's important for us. I mean, these were truly ancient pagan societies, but their insights into the world of the past, their insights into the world that our fathers experienced, and all that stuff was just wiped out. There's no telling what else we could have found there. So, any other questions?
In Israel, it's
Yeah, so things get destroyed. They were just preserved in Babylon a little bit better. I mean, you had full buildings, roofs, and everything. So in Israel, there's just been so much contention over the years. We talk about a tell. You heard me say Tel Dan. A tell is a hill. It's Tel, not Tell. A tell is a mound, but it's not just a mound. It's an archaeological mound. And the way they build cities back then, they come in, take over a city, they destroy it because they had to fight to get it. They didn't have bulldozers. Today, if we're going to knock down Sam's and build something new, we knock it down, we bulldoze it, we haul off the debris, and we come to a clean foundation and start all over. They didn't have that back then. So when they destroyed stuff, they would just destroy it even more, fill it with dirt, and then build another city on top. Well, if you get one city, 2 cities, 3 cities, 4 cities, you eventually end up with this huge hill because essentially it's multiple cities under dirt. So that's why you kind of have knee high. You know, they would destroy a wall, and once it was destroyed that far down, now you just got to pile the dirt on it and build up. And there's one, Tommy hiked it, I hiked it, my mom and Debbie hiked it. Was at Beit Shan, which was an ancient city. It's a place where they hung Saul and his sons on the city walls. But if you go up on the tail, I don't know, did you go back to the back part of it? If you go back there, they've done cuts into the mound, where you see different cities from different time periods. So you would see the ancient Canaanite city, the Israeli city, the Roman city, all right there, and it's pretty unique. So that's kind of why, knee high. I haven't really done much. I've done a lot of research in the history of Assyria and all the finds there, but not much into why it wasn't like some of those buildings were so well preserved. We have full city gates. That one of the most famous ones from Babylon was, I don't know if you've seen it, was the Gate of Ishtar. Everybody's heard of Ishtar, goddess. Gate of Ishtar was this beautiful blue gate with like dragon-looking figures and very well preserved. I think it may still be standing. They have replicas of it at the British Museum, but I think it's still standing in Iraq. Maybe they may have destroyed it back in 2015. So, any other questions? Well, I hope it was edifying, and we'll pray before we leave. Father, we thank you. We thank you for the technology that we have to have studies and to study things that involve our people and our ancestors. We thank you for the technology that we have to unearth the things of our past, that we may study them better and understand our scriptures better. I pray that anything that we learn is used to edify our walks with you and edify others that we may come in contact with. I pray for the safety of those going home tonight and those who are at home, and thank you for the opportunity that we have to come together and to glorify you. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks. Amen.